Why haven't you heard of him? A shepherd walked into the king's sanctuary in the northern kingdom around 760 BC, opened his mouth, and called the fall of an entire country 40 years before it happened. His name is Amos, and either he got it right or he didn't. Amos is one of roughly 50 prophetic voices in the Hebrew Bible. Some got it right in ash and clay, some are still being argued over. Some are still waiting to land. This video walks the whole list. Less than 40 years after Amos said it, Samaria fell to Assyria in 722 BC. The second book of Kings, chapter 17 verse 6, records the northern kingdom being dragged into exile, exactly where he said they would go. Beyond Damascus. One prophet, one verse, one archaeological layer of ash at the top of the tell at ancient Samaria. And Amos is not a one-off. Two bigger questions sit on top of him. Why does the British Museum hold an Assyrian king's own carved confession that silently confirms Isaiah's hardest prediction? And why, after everything the prophets got right, are some of their most famous warnings still completely unfulfilled? Here's the thing about prophets. The picture most people carry is a man in a cave seeing the end of the world. The picture the Bible actually gives you is a shepherd in a king's sanctuary getting the date right on the next war. The Hebrew word translated prophet is nabi. It meant a spokesperson, a messenger, someone sent to deliver a word that wasn't theirs, not a fortune teller, a watchman on a wall, calling down what he could see coming. If you've ever heard someone say the Bible is full of vague prophecies that never quite match anything, Amos is the first reason to stop and look again. There's something about a warning that lands 40 years late that changes the weight of everything else in that prophet's mouth. Because if an 8th century Judean shepherd called the fall of an entire kingdom this cleanly, with the city named and the exile direction named, what happens when you start pulling on the rest of the thread? There is a prism in the British Museum, carved in clay, about the size of a large coffee can. A king ordered it made to brag about what he had done. And the thing he most pointedly did not brag about is the reason Isaiah has a chapter on him. Amos had a contemporary. His name was Micah, and he lived in a small town in the foothills of Judah, while the Assyrian Empire was eating its way across the ancient Near East. In the first chapter of his book, verse 6, he said Samaria would be reduced to a heap of stones in an open field, its foundation laid bare. Stand at the tell of ancient Samaria today, and that is literally what you see. Collapsed walls, a dark band of ash, at the destruction layer, from 722 BC. Harvard University excavators led by George Reisner between 1908 and 1910, and a later joint expedition under John Crowfoot in the 1930s, documented that burn layer at the top of the royal quarter. The image in Micah's poem and the rocks in the ground agree. A generation later, Isaiah made a much harder call. The same Assyrian Empire that had just eaten the north came south for Judah. Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, ripped through 46 fortified Judean cities and closed in on Jerusalem. And Isaiah, in chapter 37, verses 33 through 35, said flatly that Sennacherib would not enter the city. No arrow shot, no siege ramp raised, he would go home. If you have ever watched someone bet their life on a prediction and thought the number couldn't possibly hold, Isaiah was doing that in public, in real time, with an empire camped outside the walls. Now the Assyrians kept excellent records. Every campaign, every city taken, every king humiliated, all of it pressed into clay while the battle dust was still settling. Sennacherib's own account of the 701 BC campaign sits on that prism in the British Museum. It lists the Judean cities he took. It lists his conquest of the countryside. It describes Hezekiah, the king of Judah, shut up in Jerusalem like a caged bird. Picture that for a second. An Assyrian king writing his own victory monument, reaching the moment of his biggest target, and dropping a detail that should be the climax of the whole campaign. Except, he never claims it. The Taylor Prism never says he took Jerusalem. The conquest list stops at the gates. The bird stays in the cage. The one brag a king on a victory monument would not leave out is the one brag that is missing. And that silence is Isaiah's receipt. 2 prophets, 2 cities, 2 outside witnesses, in ash and in clay. If this is what happened when 2 8th century prophets called specific cities, what happened when a whole prophetic book was written about the destruction of the capital of the ancient world? Sometimes, a city dies all at once. Nineveh didn't. Nineveh died in one summer, and the world forgot where it had been for almost 2,500 years. A prophet named Nahum wrote one short book, 3 chapters, all of it about the coming destruction of a single city. Not a vague empire, not a symbolic Babylon, Nineveh, by name, by river, by specific gate. At the time he wrote, Nineveh was the most powerful city on earth. Walls so thick a chariot could turn on them. The capital of the Assyrian Empire, which had, less than a century earlier, swallowed the northern kingdom and come very close to swallowing the southern one too. Think about what it would take to read Nahum's book in real time. You are writing about the death of the empire that runs the world, and the empire has not fallen yet. In 612 BC, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes surrounded Nineveh, joined by northern nomadic allies that some ancient sources identify with the Scythians, a people from north of the Black Sea. The alliance breached the walls, the city burned in one summer campaign, and it burned so completely that for 2,500 years, the city lay in ruins under mounds of earth, its exact identity disputed until 19th century excavators confirmed the site. The site was rediscovered in the 1840s by British excavators, sifting through mounds of dirt in what is now northern Iraq. The identification held because the archaeologists matched the place they found to Nahum's description of it and to the Babylonian Chronicle. The Chronicle is a set of clay tablets kept by Babylonian scribes recording year-by-year events. Tablet BM 21901 in the British Museum records the fall of Nineveh in the 14th year of the Babylonian king Nabopolassar. The prophetic book and the royal archive line up on the same summer. Then Jeremiah went further. He wrote through the worst decades of Judah's history, and in chapter 25, verses 11 and 12, he put a number on the coming Babylonian exile. 70 years. Here's the thing about a 70-year prediction. You only get to make it once, and either your great-grandchildren hold you to it, or they don't. Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians in 586 BC, exactly as Jeremiah said it would. The temple was burned. The people were carried into exile. And then in 539 BC, the Persian king Cyrus conquered Babylon and issued an edict, recorded in the opening chapter of the book of Ezra, allowing the exiles to return. The first returns began the next year. Count the gap. About 47 years from the fall, about 68 from the first deportation in 605 BC that Jeremiah himself lived through. The return lands inside his 70-year window. Nahum called a superpower's capital by name. Jeremiah put a specific number on a specific exile. The cleanest prophets left paper trails that reach us through dirt and clay, but some of the most famous names in the Bible never wrote anything down. Elijah, Nathan, Samuel. How do you verify a warning that was never written in the prophet's own voice? There's a strange thing about famous people. The ones who shaped history the most didn't always leave paperwork. No memoir, no manuscript, no folder with their name on the spine, just other people's accounts of what they said. Think about how you know what Socrates taught. You don't have a book by him, you have Plato writing about him. The Bible has its own version of that, and it's where some of the most famous prophets live. Elijah and Elisha, together, occupy about 15 chapters of 1st and 2nd Kings, confronting the northern dynasty of Omri and Ahab in the 9th century BC. In 1 Kings chapter 21, Elijah told Ahab that every male heir of his house would be wiped out, and that the dogs would devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. 2 Kings chapter 9 records a general named Jehu riding into Jezreel, where Jezebel was thrown from an upper window at his command, and executing Ahab's entire line in the days that followed. The warning is in one chapter. The outcome is 8 chapters later. Both are in the same book. Nathan did it closer in. In 2 Samuel chapter 12, he walked into the king's presence and told David, to his face, that the sword would never depart from his house because of what he had done to Uriah. The family narrative that follows, Amnon and Absalom and Adonijah, is the documentation of that warning. Every tragedy in David's later life reads as a footnote to Nathan's sentence. Samuel anointed Saul, then told Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 28, that the kingdom would be torn away from him and given to someone better. It was. Samuel didn't live to see David take the throne, but the verse stands in the text, and so does the outcome. If you have ever had the person closest to you be the one who told you a hard truth nobody else would say, you have met the kind of prophet Nathan was. He did that to his own king, in his own palace, while the king was still in power. Think of an old city records office. Rows of wooden filing cabinets, each drawer labeled with a year. Some files have the full case record: court transcript, photographs, signed affidavits, a final ruling. Some files hold only witness statements with no verdict attached. And some files are still open. No ruling yet. That is what the prophets look like when you lay their warnings out on the same table. Closed drawers, witness-only drawers, and open drawers, all in the same cabinet, all filed under the same century. The prophets come to us the same way. Some warnings are closed cases, verified down to the year, in ash and clay. Some are on file inside Scripture's own narratives, without separate books. And some are still open, waiting. If you are starting to see patterns across these warnings that you were never taught in a Sunday school class, send this video to someone who loves reading the Bible carefully. It's going to land differently, for them too. So take a breath and look at where we are. Amos called it. A shepherd from Judah delivered a warning about the fall of the northern kingdom. And Samaria fell exactly where and when he said. Micah, Isaiah, Nahum, Jeremiah. 4 more names, 4 more warnings, with archaeological receipts. The ruins of Samaria, the silence on Sennacherib's prism, the Babylonian Chronicle's account of Nineveh. The 70-year window Jeremiah put a number on. And now Elijah, Nathan, and Samuel, prophets with no books, whose warnings live in the same scripture that records their outcomes. 8 names, 8 warnings, 8 outcomes. And the record keeps holding. But we are not done with the no-book prophets yet. Ahab, the king Elijah confronted, had one more prophet walking around the kingdom, and Ahab hated him specifically. His name was Micaiah, son of Imlah. In 1 Kings chapter 22, 2 kings sat in thrones at the city gate, listening to 400 yes-men promise them victory at Ramoth-Gilead. Micaiah told them the king would not come back from that battle alive. Ahab went anyway, disguised in common armor so nobody could pick him out, and a random archer drew back a bow at random, and the arrow found the one seam in his armor. Notice what just happened. Not one of these 4 prophets wrote a book named after himself. Their warnings and their outcomes both live inside the same historical narrative, which is a different kind of record, but it is still a record. Some prophets hold up cleanly, in stone and in scripture. But the next tier is where honest readers have to slow down, because this is where the scholarly consensus breaks. What happens when one prophet names a future king by his actual name 150 years before he's born? Imagine getting a letter dated 1825 that somehow describes a smartphone. You'd assume one of 2 things. Either the letter is miraculous, or the date on it is wrong. Bible scholarship has been making that choice for 200 years. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 44, verse 28, and chapter 45, verse 1, a specific future king is named by name, Cyrus. The text calls him God's shepherd and says he will rebuild Jerusalem and send the exiles home. The historical Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BC and issued exactly that return edict. The catch is, when Isaiah was written. The traditional reading, which treats the entire book as the work of an 8th century prophet named Isaiah, makes this a prediction by name a century and a half before Cyrus was born. A remarkable long-range call. The critical reading, which emerged in 19th century German scholarship and remains the scholarly consensus today, argues that chapters 40 through 55 of Isaiah were actually written during or just after the exile, by a later prophet in the tradition, naming Cyrus from inside his own era. The position is serious. It is the standard reading in most academic commentaries, and the argument cannot be set aside. Daniel runs on a parallel rail. The book presents detailed prophetic visions of 4 successive kingdoms in chapters 2 and 7. Traditional scholarship maps them to Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, and the Greek-era detail becomes an impressive long-range prediction. Critical scholarship, which is the dominant academic reading today, dates the book of Daniel to the 2nd century BC Maccabean crisis, the uprising of Jewish fighters in 167 BC against Greek rulers who had desecrated the temple. On that reading, the Greek-era prophecies were written after the fact, and the 4 kingdoms mapped to Babylon, Media, Persia, and Greece, stopping short of Rome. Here's where you have to make a choice as a viewer. Not about what you believe, but about which reading you're tracking as you listen. The evidence is real on both sides. The dating question is genuinely unsettled in academic scholarship, and the honest ledger has to hold both. If you have ever been in a conversation where 2 serious people looked at the same evidence and reached opposite conclusions in good faith, that is what's happening with Isaiah 40 and Daniel 7. Both readings take the text seriously. They just disagree on when. There's one more contested case, and it's the most textbook honest of the three. Ezekiel, in chapter 26, delivered an oracle against the island city of Tyre. Nebuchadnezzar would besiege it. The stones would be thrown into the sea. Ships would pass over the place where the city had been. Nebuchadnezzar besieged Tyre for 13 years in the early 6th century BC. He did not finish it. 250 years later, Alexander the Great finished the job in 332 BC by building a causeway to the island with the rubble of the mainland city. The stones went into the sea. Ships now pass over the place. Stop and picture that for a second. Two kings, 250 years apart, jointly fulfilling one oracle. Two different readers can look at that and reach different verdicts honestly. One reader calls it fulfilled, another reader calls it a partial fulfillment stretched across centuries. The book prophets and the famous prophets have been covered. The contested ones have been named. But there's a group of prophets who almost never get listed at all, and one of them held the fate of the last great reform in Jerusalem in her hands. There's a moment in a quiet workroom, behind a closed door, where a small group of people decided whether a document in their possession was the real thing. The moment is almost never told in Sunday school. It's 2 Kings 22, and it's the hinge the last great reform in Judah swung on. 4 women in the Old Testament are explicitly called prophetesses. Miriam, in Exodus chapter 15 verse 20, leads Israel in song at the Red Sea. Deborah, in Judges 4 and 5, is both a judge and a prophetess, and her song in Judges 5 is one of the oldest Hebrew texts in the Bible. Isaiah's wife is called the prophetess in chapter 8 verse 3, and Huldah is the one almost nobody knows. During the reign of King Josiah, in the late 7th century BC, workers renovating the temple found a lost scroll of the law. The high priest took it to the king. The king tore his clothes. And then the senior officials of the kingdom, the high priest, the king's secretary, the royal scribe, took that scroll and walked it across Jerusalem to verify it. They did not take it to Jeremiah, who was active in the city at the time. They did not take it to Zephaniah, they took it to Huldah. Read that chapter slowly sometime. The workroom was real, the scroll was real, the woman was real. And what she did in that room shaped everything that came next. If you have ever been the person in a room whose call everyone was waiting for, you know the weight Huldah carried in that chapter. She authenticated the scroll. She delivered a warning that Jerusalem would still fall under the judgment written in it, because the people had turned from the covenant. And then she delivered a specific word about Josiah himself, that he would die in peace before the disaster came. Jerusalem fell in 586 BC. Josiah died in 609 BC, before the city fell. Both halves of her word landed. A minor bulla, a small clay seal used to close documents, bearing the name of a figure from that period, has been recovered from archaeological excavations in Jerusalem, which is the closest material trace the chapter has outside the text. There's more to say, and scholars still argue the specifics, but the textual account of Huldah's moment is among the most carefully recorded prophetic verdicts in the entire Hebrew Bible. Luke chapter 2 verses 36 through 38 extends the pattern into the New Testament. Anna, a prophetess who lived in the temple, recognized the infant Jesus at his presentation. A woman naming what she saw in a temple, carrying the same title Huldah carried 600 years earlier. There is a shelf in every Bible where the books suddenly shrink. You pass through Kings and Chronicles and the long prophets, and then the pages get thin. A book of 3 chapters, a book of 2, a book of 1. Short is not small. 12 prophetic books are called minor, and the name refers only to length. Start with Jonah. In the book of Jonah, chapter 1, he runs from a call to preach judgment to Nineveh. He is thrown overboard, swallowed by a great fish, spit back onto shore, and goes. In chapter 3, verse 5, the city repents. The king sits in ashes. Judgment is delayed. Now hold that next to Nahum. Jonah preached at Nineveh roughly a century before Nahum did. The city that repented under Jonah returned to its old violence in the next generation. And then Nahum came, and in 612 BC, Nineveh fell exactly as he said. 2 prophets, 1 city, 2 generations apart. Both words landed. Obadiah is the shortest book in the Old Testament. 1 chapter, 21 verses, every word aimed at Edom, the territory just south of the Dead Sea. In verses 15 through 18, Obadiah calls for Edom's desolation. In the centuries after the exile, Nabatean Arabs overran the region, and Edom ceased to exist as a distinct people. Zephaniah, in chapter 2, verse 13, called the fall of Nineveh before Nahum did. 2 minor prophets on one superpower, a doubled receipt. Then come the ones where honest readers differ. Hosea prophesied alongside Amos in the 8th century BC. In chapter 1, verse 4, he called the end of the northern dynasty. That part landed in 722 BC. His chapter 14 oracles on restoration are where traditions read different futures. Joel in chapter 2, verses 28 through 32, described an outpouring of the Spirit that Peter quotes in Acts chapter 2, verse 17, as fulfilled at Pentecost. The rest of Joel is still open. Habakkuk, writing just before the Babylonian invasion, asked why God would use a more violent nation to punish a less violent one. His specific call in chapter 1, verses 5 and 6, that the Babylonians would rise, landed inside his own lifetime. If you have ever prayed a hard question honestly and not gotten a clean answer, Habakkuk is the prophet who wrote that prayer down. And then, after the exile, 2 prophets did something unusual. They came back. Haggai, in chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, stood in the rubble of the old temple in 520 BC and told the returnees to stop paneling their own houses and finish rebuilding God's. The temple was completed in 516 BC, as recorded in Ezra chapter 6, verse 15. Zechariah stood beside him in those same years, delivering visions that encouraged the work. His longer passages in chapters 9 through 14 point to messianic figures that different traditions read in different ways. Notice what just happened. 12 minor prophets. 8 of them passed through this chapter. Amos, Micah, and Nahum were already in the ledger earlier in this video. Malachi is still ahead of you. Every major and minor prophet of the Old Testament has a verdict now, and the verdict is the same shape it has been the whole video. Some closed, some contested, some still speaking. But there is a category under those 3 that never quite closes. Which warnings did the Bible itself leave open? That's the closed cases. The prophets without books, the contested ones, the women who saw, the minor prophets with their short books and sharp calls. But the ledger isn't finished, because some of the most specific warnings the prophets ever spoke have not yet landed. There's a specific kind of letter almost nobody thinks about. Letters that were sent but never arrived. Sealed, stamped, addressed, dropped in the slot, and then, somewhere in the system, they simply didn't land. Not lost, not returned, just still moving. You can read scripture the same way. Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, promises a world where the nations will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and where nations will not learn war anymore. No honest reading of the world can pretend that promise has landed. It is not ambiguous. It is specific. Swords into plowshares, and the promise remains carved on the Isaiah wall in Ralph Bunche Park, directly across from the United Nations headquarters in New York. And it remains on the table of every reader who has ever counted the wars in a given year. Ezekiel in chapters 40 through 48 describes a restored temple in architectural detail, cubit by cubit, chamber by chamber, gate by gate. That temple has never been built. The description sits in the text as a blueprint whose commissioner has never arrived. And Malachi, the final book of the Old Testament, closes with a promise that Elijah will return before the day of the Lord. The New Testament, in Matthew chapter 11, verse 14, reads that promise figuratively through John the Baptist. But the Hebrew text points toward a literal figure, and the discussion of how that promise opens or closes remains alive. Isaiah's promise of a world where nations stop teaching their children to fight is not a closed case. It's a letter still in transit. Ezekiel's temple is blueprints in a drawer. Malachi's last word is a door left open. If you have ever waited for something you were promised and could not make arrive, you know this posture. The prophets know it too. Most of them died before their own warnings landed. So what do you do with a ledger that is partly closed, partly contested, and partly still open? First, the prophets were not fortune tellers. They were covenant watchmen whose job was now, not later. They stood in their own cities, in their own decades, and spoke about the next war, the next fall, the next return. That their warnings carry across 2,700 years is almost an accident of how well they understood their own moment. Second, the record is real and the record is honest. Some warnings are closed cases. Amos, Micah, Nahum, Jeremiah, Isaiah on Sennacherib. Some are on file inside Scripture's own narratives without separate books. Elijah, Nathan, Samuel, Micaiah, Huldah. And some are genuinely contested. Isaiah on Cyrus, Daniel's 4 kingdoms, Ezekiel's Tyre. On those, the honest move is to say so. And the third thing, the one that stays with me the most, is this. The open warnings are still open. Isaiah's world without war, Ezekiel's restored temple. The Bible does not pretend these have landed. It keeps them open on purpose. Which means whatever you think about the prophets, they are not finished speaking. Somewhere in 760 BC, a shepherd from the hills of Judah walked into a foreign sanctuary and said out loud what nobody wanted to hear. 40 years later, every word he said came true. And 2,700 years later, you are still listening for him. Somewhere in 760 BC, a shepherd walked into a sanctuary that was not his own and said out loud what nobody wanted to hear. The torch smoke is gone now. The worshippers are gone. The sanctuary is gone. But the shepherd is still talking. And the walls around you are the ones that weathered. If you want more videos that walk through the Bible this carefully, subscribe.